doing this for 2 miles, and I think maybe most of us in here can do a 2-mile jog with no issues, you're not really going to need a huge meal before that. I would focus on some hydration for sure, but you're not going to need a bunch of honey and all of the oatmeal and all of that stuff for a 2-mile jog. So it varies depending on intensity. So whether you fast or not, it kind of depends on a lot of different factors. And hopefully I answered that person's question.
You know, we fall in, and this is partially our fault as well. And Rob, when he spoke about doing CrossFit and paleo, I'm likely to blame. My email was I am Paleo Mike for quite some time. So, but we fall into this dogmatic point of view when it comes to nutrition. It's almost like religion. And if you go opposed to this, you just don't know what you're talking about. And then talking about the confirmational biases, our algorithm knows what we like. So if you're a vegan, it's going to feed you vegan stuff, confirming what you believe. So we jump into these rabbit holes of what we think is the right and the wrong. And when you listen to Eric, although he is sexy, what he's saying is not sexy because it's not based on rules. He never speaks in absolute, ironically enough. He always asks you, it depends. So if you see some of the ways that he's answering your questions, if he was to get one of you up in the office and quiz you for 3 hours, a lot of the things are going to say, a lot of his answers are going to be that it depends on what your goals are. So if you can, try to disassociate yourself from what you've learned and what you listen to on social media, because a lot of these high-viewed reels is because they're outlandish. And when you get somebody like Eric that's speaking reasonably, it doesn't necessarily garner those amounts of views. Does that make sense? So you see these gurus out there on social media that have this huge following only because they're telling you, this is bullshit. I don't know if you guys know what I'm talking about. Excuse my language here. But olive oil is bullshit. McDonald's fries is bullshit.
Do they shop in a grocery store without a shirt?
Yeah. I won't say his name. But so just try to understand that it gets more complicated than just what you're seeing. Fad diets, paleo, keto, they have a purpose. Most of them put you in a caloric deficit, and that's why you're losing weight. When we ask the purpose of not eating rice, it's just something that you've probably learned over the years. And this is what we fell into when we took on paleo as a CrossFit community is we had one of the leading authorities in Rob Wolf pushing paleo in the CrossFit community, understanding that this is how people are going to lose weight, but not necessarily increase their performance. And when I got it, when I jumped on, I was 233 and I went down to 204 and I was depleted and I was losing muscle mass and I couldn't understand why. And then I realized, oh shit, I fell into the Dunning-Kruger effect. I thought that this was the way to go. And then I met somebody named Lane Norton, which he discussed earlier. And I realized, I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. And then I kind of revamped the way that I viewed nutrition. And Eric has helped put me in my place as well. All right, so I'm going to ask this question, Eric, that kind of has not been answered in what you spoke of earlier. For women specifically, sorry, I'm blind. For women specifically, how do you know you're losing fat in a caloric deficit if the scale doesn't move? So I guess this ties into BMR and dropping your calories and your BMR meeting the calorie deficit.
Yeah, so for her in particular, taking body measurements would be beneficial. Pictures would also help. Like, how do you know if you're losing body fat but the scale's not moving? Well, I would assume that if it's not purely based on fluid retention, if like we're doing all things right and it's not just fluid retention that's happening, because you also got to consider with women the period, and with your period there's going to be fluctuations in hormones, retention of fluid and whatnot. But I would just kind of either base it on how the clothes is fitting, taking pictures like before and afters, if you will, and taking measurements, because a lot of times this is what I'll hear, man, the weight, like I've been doing this for 8 weeks and like the scale went down by only 1 pound, but like my clothes is fitting so much better. Like I'm looking leaner, and that's the answer right there. A lot of times you can kind of tell in how the clothes is fitting. Unfortunately, we base too much of our success on what the scale says. And the scale is just one factor to help us measure. If I tell women, like we'll talk about creatine sometimes, and I'll say the only proven side effect to creatine, could be good or could be bad, is weight gain. You hear that, what do you think?
Fat.
Gaining fat, weight. That word weight is like the worst thing possible. Unfortunately, especially for women. And I hate that because we've been telling women for too long that you gotta be small, you gotta be skinny. It's like, no, everyone should be lifting heavy shit on a very regular basis, right? So when we think about the fact that we put too much on this scale, too much importance on this scale, and we forget well, how am I actually looking? How am I feeling? Right? How's my clothes fitting? Right? Sometimes even getting the validation from either our partner or a friend, just kind of saying, hey, like, you look like you've maybe put on a little bit of muscle mass. Take that in a good way, right? You know, you've maybe leaned out, right? So thinking about those things, if the scale isn't particularly moving, but we're seeing those positive changes, then take that. Don't base everything on what the scale says, right? It's not going to tell you how much water, how much muscle, and those sorts of things.
I'll just touch on this briefly, and Eric, you can follow up with it if you want. These fad diets, so somebody's 60 pounds overweight, you know the person, New Year's comes around, and then they go ahead and jump on, pick a diet, keto, Mediterranean, South Beach, whatnot. And all of a sudden they start shedding weight, right? The first portion of this weight that they shed is water weight, because more than likely it's going to be a low carbohydrate diet. That's in some sort of template, it's a low carb diet. So when you release carbohydrates, you release glycogen, and water follows. So they're losing water weight initially. And then as the time goes on, week number 2, week number 3, they're continuing to shed weight. Why do we think that is? Why are they losing weight? Is it the magic of the diet, or is it just basic caloric deficit? They put themselves in a caloric deficit, the same thing that Eric would do with your numbers, but he's going to put it at more of a healthy and safe range to protect muscle mass, right? So they lose all this weight, and then 6-8 weeks later, they don't lose any more weight. Their scale doesn't move anymore. So now the only option is train more or eat less. How do you think that person's feeling or performing? They're miserable. They're a grouchy wife and husband. They're a, because I don't want to point at my actual wife, but that's the state in which they get. And then what happens? Here comes the bachelorette party or the wedding or whatnot. That event passes, and now all of a sudden they go back to eating. Well, and what they did was they dropped their BMR, basal metabolic rate. They dropped their BMR, so now they're starting to lose all this weight. But now they don't have that BMR to protect them anymore. So then when they go back to eating the other way, the way they used to, not only do they gain that weight back, but they gain more because they don't have that protective measure anymore. Does that make sense? So the best way, or the magic that happens behind all these named diets, is that you're putting yourself in a caloric deficit, which is why it's so important sometimes to either listen or hire a nutrition coach, because they're going to put you at a deficit that burns fat, if you will, but protects muscle mass. And it's a slow decrease over time, right? If he sees you're losing too much weight too fast, he's going to say something's going on here. You're not either hitting your numbers or we're now tapping into muscle loss, which we don't, depending on your size at the time. Make sense? So going back to the BJJ side, Eric, let's talk a little bit about supplementation here, right? So they're asking, what are good supplements for jiu-jitsu? Let's throw CrossFit in there as well for performance. Also, the pros and cons of taking creatine, which is one of your favorite supplements.
For sure. The supplements for that in particular, I would say creatine would be one. Beta-alanine would be another one. Beta-alanine, it's like a muscle buffer. So it allows you to perform at higher intensities for a little bit longer. So before you start feeling that muscle burn, it'll help you kind of keep going for a little more, and then eventually you do start feeling it. The downside to beta-alanine is that you get tingles. Some people hate it, some people love it, some people are whatever about it, but it feels like spiders are crawling inside your skin. So I would recommend beta-alanine. I'd recommend creatine. I'd also recommend protein supplements just to help make sure that we're getting enough protein on a regular basis. I'd also recommend carbohydrates, whether you use it as like a powder or eating enough carbs. So being mindful of that, because you can supplement with carbs as well. In some cases, I would also recommend electrolytes. So I brought a couple of electrolytes that I'll use. So electrolytes have gotten to be pretty popular. You could also just add a little more salt to your food. Sodium is the one that we lose the most in sweat. And you could even make your own. You can buy like sodium chloride and kind of mix it with whatever you might want. Or you can just kind of pay for like the overpriced packets or whatever. So here you have one brand called Drip Drop. It has this sticker on it. I got it from Amazon. Drip Drop. This one has a little bit less sodium. So in one packet, you're getting 330 milligrams of sodium. Maybe not on a crazy heavy training day, but this could be good. And then you have LMNT is how it's spelled. Element is how it's pronounced. And this one has 1,000 milligrams of sodium, right? So we oftentimes forget about electrolytes too. You'll see a lot of people starting to drink these. It's like the new Gatorade. People, athletes used to just drink Gatorade just because it tastes good or whatever else. I think people are now starting to do that with electrolytes. You can get too much electrolytes, but you're also at risk of depleting yourself in electrolytes if you're training on a regular basis. So to kind of summarize that, beta-alanine, creatine, protein and carb supplements, and electrolytes, specifically thinking about performance in hand. I would also recommend for BJJ and CrossFit too, collagen supplements for joint health and tendon health and that sort of thing. And maybe even considering something like glucosamine for your joints as well for the long run. Not directly performance related, but eventually performance related, right?
Bobby, since we're on this topic, there's a tournament coming up November 4th, okay? And Jose, you could correct me if I'm wrong here. In between matches, it could be anywhere between 15 to 30 minutes for the big one?
50, 20 minutes, depending how big the bracket is.
Okay.
Right. So they're redlining for 5-6 minutes, taking 20 minutes off, and then right back onto the mat. What would you recommend intra match?
So intra-match, not a whole lot. The first thing is being mindful of gastrointestinal issues, right? I don't want anything that's gonna mess me up. So maybe like a liquid carb could be good. I would stick to like the simple carbs. I wouldn't do anything very high in fiber, nor very high in fat. But sticking to like a little bit of honey. If you just wanted to have a small amount of like white rice and a little bit of protein, again, managing GI issues is going to be important. But I think a lot of times we just forget about hydration. So at least making sure that we're staying hydrated. You may or may not need electrolytes. I guess it depends on how many matches it might be. But electrolytes could be okay in that point in time. But I would just keep it very simple and not overdo it on nutrition. Even like a little bit of fruit. Again, whatever you could stomach in this time point, and that isn't going to cause more issues going into your next match is what I want to think about. So it's what's the word I'm looking for? It's like a mitigating risk, right? So it's like prevention of something happening on there.
Your body's going to be at a certain state for that match. You definitely don't want to make it worse.
Yeah.
Right? And there's a lot of foods, there's a lot of stuff you could do with eating the wrong food to make you feel worse rolling out on the match. Because what's more important? Is more important the fuel that you have in your body that you might have had in the 20 minutes prior, or actually how you feel? What's going to impact you more, right? No, if you feel good, even if your body's closer to zero, if you feel good, I guarantee you, you're probably going to perform better over that next match. So like, don't try to perfect something if you already are feeling good.
And something else to keep in mind that you just made me think of is ideally not trying anything new on the day of the event, whether it is a BJJ comp, a CrossFit competition, or running a half marathon. I wouldn't just start like pounding those goo gels and stuff just because they're like quick sugar. That can give you some GI issues. Also think about like if you're gonna go into a competition, like you're getting in there, it's you or them. You know what I'm saying? And you might get a little bit of stress from that. Maybe there's some nerves, some excitement, but that can mess with your GI as well. So thinking, is eating something even gonna benefit me right now? Because stress greatly impacts our body's ability to just have a properly functioning gastrointestinal tract.
Yeah, like don't make the first time you try caffeine gum at a really big wrestling tournament.
For sure.
I destroyed the match right after consuming the gum, but then I crashed and the rest of that was not that good. That was fun.
Do you have any more questions on your...
I have not received any more questions, no.
Do you guys have any general questions?
I have a kind of like a personal question, maybe some people could tell me about it. So, about a year and a half ago, I lived in Michigan. So
I have a girlfriend, bro. I'm sorry.
So I lived in Michigan like a year and a half ago for like a year. I was working a lot, and I was training hard. But it wasn't CrossFit. It was more like bodybuilding. I didn't have much time to cook, so I was religiously eating McDonald's and Taco Bell for like a year straight. But I was lean as hell.
Yeah.
Because like that's probably like the best shape I've been physically.
Like body fat percentage wise?
I didn't check my body fat.
But I'm saying like you looked and felt?
Yeah, I felt great. I felt strong, and I feel like I looked great.
Yeah.
But I was eating like trash.
Sure.
I was legit eating trash. But so I'm not sure how that happened. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, where my head goes is you were feeding the beast. You were eating enough to fuel your activity, right? Like I'm not advocating for them, but like this morning, I woke up a little bit late. I was in a rush to get in here. My breakfast, not usual, but I got Burger King for breakfast, right? I had 2 egg and cheese croissants and a small hash brown. That was literally my breakfast this morning. Is it common? No. But that's where the 80-20 rule kind of comes in. 80% of the time, doing what's going to be optimal for my health and performance. 20% of the time, leave it for indulgence and not being able to control the controllables. In your particular case, schedule was crazy. Maybe it wasn't the best quality food that you were eating, but you were probably eating enough. Like going back to what I said about having someone from Tour de France, not that I work with a Tour de France athlete, but if I'm working with someone who's burning 10,000 calories, I'm not kidding when I say, yeah, for sure, drink Coke with whatever, with your pizza. You know what I'm saying? I'm just trying to get you to have enough calories. So you're probably just fueling yourself properly from a caloric standpoint. Maybe the macros could have been adjusted, but ultimately you had the results. You were performing well and all those sorts of things. I don't know what maybe your blood work would have looked like. Maybe good, maybe not, right? That's one of those things that maybe eventually it catches up. But from a performance and physique state of perspective, you were at least fueling yourself enough is what it sounds like, right? At least to perform, but also to maybe lean out, where you like kind of lean at that point too. So you were eating enough to perform, but also lean out. So maybe you were in a consistent caloric deficit, and that's what kind of like what Mike was saying. If I'm going to recommend numbers to somebody, very few times is it going to be a drastic caloric deficit. I want someone, if they're trying to lose body fat and perform, I'm going to want them on as many calories as possible while still on a deficit. So if you're burning 3,000 calories a day, I'll be like, look, let's try getting to like 2,700. Only a 300 calorie deficit, but still helping to make sure that you're performing as best as possible. Of course, we would have the conversation of what's more important, your physique or your performance, because intensity also helps drive certain goals in our workouts, right? So intensity is one determining factor. If you're not eating enough to support that intensity, then that's going to be a problem, right? So you were probably just eating enough to support your training, but not to support body fat storage, right? Again, the quality matters, but in this particular case, just looking at that, you were perfectly fine. Because quantity is going to be important. That's where we talk about macros and enough calories and those sorts of things. But going back to the example of this plate and the Oreos, two totally different quality, both the exact same amount of quantity, right? Quality is going to impact the quantity. So this one, more than likely, you're not going to overeat if you're eating that way on a regular basis. Again, this is me oversimplifying. Plenty of things can impact overeating. This one, more likely to overeat. Processed food, it doesn't make us feel full and it tastes really good. That's a terrible combination because it's going to drive us to eat more. Right? That's where overconsumption of it is bad. But in your case, I mean, it worked.
You know, Chado Trocinco brags about his McDonald's diet all the time. Barry Sears, the author of The Zone Diet, he had Evander Holyfield as a client. And as he was giving both templates to Evander, he said, you could either have 6 cups of broccoli or 15 French fries from McDonald's. And Evander, as remember how ripped he was, always chose the 15 French fries from McDonald's. The one qualm about that, like Eric was saying, was the fact of the micronutrient side of it, like making sure that their nutrients are coming from somewhere. And I think that's where the new, you know, what is it, AG1, the supplementation is. It's just a supplement. It's just make sure that in your diet you're including all these micronutrients. But it's what Eric says. You're probably training high enough to where you're caloric. You could have those high-calorie meals. The only thing that we'd watch is the micronutrients. Plus, you were probably a lot younger, right? Okay.
And I mean, over 1 year of fast food, obviously you're going to have some negative impacts from that, maybe certain things, but you start doing that for a decade, 2 decades, right? You had 10 years, 15 years of all you're eating is fast food, you probably would see some negative implications from that food quality that you might not have seen over a year.
And the weight gain could also come, in addition to the calories, is sedentary, because now you're going to get married, and then you're going to have a kid, and those 3 hours that you used to spend in the gym now are gone. Now it's maybe 1 hour in a CrossFit. So we become lazier. That's why we become fatter, not necessarily. People think, oh, your metabolism, oh, I'm old, that's why my metabolism is so down, I'm fat. No, it's because you've got I use lazy, and it's a blunt word to use, but because we're not as active, our priorities aren't there as when I was a 22-year-old football player. Now I got family, children, business, work, stuff that I got to do. So
we did really expand on that in a recent podcast.
Yeah.
We have 7 or 8.
Yeah, shameless plug.
On
right?
metabolism.
Yeah.
Any other nutrition questions before we go a little bit over to the training side of things, then open it back up to questions again on anything?
I heard that like vitamins, like the pills, are difficult to absorb. Is that true?
Not necessarily, no. In some cases, it could be if someone has like Well, that's a little bit different because I would recommend using a supplement that has been third-party tested. So there's different websites like labdoor.com. They'll test certain labdoor, yeah, like the door of a laboratory. Labdoor.com, they'll have supplements on there that they'll test. And they'll test for banned substances. They'll test for like truth to labeling. But then you could also look at the actual bottle or the container. And I'm a fan of Informed Choice, which is a third-party brand. There's also NSF. So those those are usually the better ones because not all supplements are created equal. But from an absorption standpoint, assuming that it's a reputable brand, if you will, our body does a pretty good job of using whatever it needs and getting rid of whatever it doesn't.
All right, so quickly talking about training now. So how many of you guys are from the BJJ gym? Most of you guys, perfect. And do you work out 5 or more times a week or less than 5 times a week? Raise your hand for 5 or more. All right, 5 or more, perfect. And how many of you guys work out with weights? This is everyone now. Work out with weights at least 4 or 5 times a week. How many of you guys less than 5 times a week? It's okay, I work out less than 5 times a week a lot. Perfect, all right. And how many of you guys have questions about potentially working out too much or working out not enough? Working out too much? A question? All right, kind of modulating stress, we'll start there. All right, so when we start talking about training and workouts, we talk about stress, right? Everyone knows what stress is, but do you know that there's a good stress and a bad stress? Right, good stress is called eustress, bad stress is called distress. How you perform, how you live is